Hello. In this video I would like to offer a few more thoughts into our discussion about the theme of artificial intelligence. I think everyone will feel that this theme is a natural progression from last week's theme, which was technology, and I think it will be clear to everyone that these two topics are intimately and even inextricably related. The notion of artificial intelligence is in some way almost the apotheosis or the extreme degree and almost transcendence of technology itself. I guess I specifically have in mind it's clearly a common theme in the collective psyche right now. I have in mind the notion that technology might in fact begin to supersede the creatures that have been using it to their advantage and been designing it, right? So if we recall from the picture that the Prometheus myth gives us, is that in some way the capacity for technology, it's either stolen or bestowed on human beings, and then human beings are able to in some ways shape the earth and in some ways achieve a sort of predominance amongst the rest of nature because of their ability to manipulate technology and make use of fire as an external energy source. And not only is the fire constrained to the physical and the natural body, but the kind of transformative process of fire, human beings can manipulate it in the outer world, right? And then if we imagine the notion of this kind of progression, and we've seen this, I think everyone watching this video can just think back and we see this in our own lifetimes, the rate of change in technology. It seems so rapid, like it's hard to keep up almost. If we just kind of continue to extrapolate, which many artists and thinkers have done, it becomes clear that a significant sort of a sea change could be on the horizon, and this will be no surprise, I think, when I'm about to say that the notion that technology could somehow begin to dominate us, right? And this was, I think, one of the reasons that I've thought of The Matrix, this movie that came out around the turn of the millennium. I've thought of The Matrix as, in many ways, it's almost a hallmark of this age. It's because it addresses that specific concern and maybe subconscious or maybe it's conscious fear or concern that people have about the notion that in some ways it's like an uprising of this kind of class of beings that we have created, and we're almost afraid that they're going to rise up against us, right? And this was in The Matrix, this was the initial premise. It's like the robots had taken over the earth and they'd begun to use human beings purely for instrumental means, which is the way we ordinarily, what's the way we use technology? It's what we think of with technology. We think of it as instruments to basically aid us and enable us and make our work more efficient, basically. And it's not difficult to see why it's a legitimate concern in many ways if we just again extrapolate from our own lifetimes and see the rate at which technology and specifically what we you call by the term artificial intelligence, the way that the rate at which it has developed. I think it's clear that it's clear why a premise like the Matrix premise, it's not difficult for people to accept, right? And then it becomes much more grave what the movie is presenting. So I hope with this, by approaching this theme of artificial intelligence and exploring it and seeking to understand it, I hope that we can at least, I hope that by the time our exploration of this theme concludes, that we all feel not necessarily that we have specific answers to things, or that we have assembled a number of facts about this. Rather, I hope and again, this is in the spirit of the rest of the course too, I hope that we can think critically about artificial intelligence, and so our week and our discussions will be successful to the degree that we come out of the other side of this with a clearer, more comprehensive, deeper picture and understanding and insight into what we really mean when we say artificial intelligence. And so a part of that question we have been in some ways implicitly grappling with this entire semester, which is the way that I expressed it in the last video. It's to formulate a theory of intelligence. And that's just a way of saying we have to know what intelligence is so we can recognize it when we see it. And so a theory of intelligence, it's similar to having a theory of gravitation, for example. If I drop a cup or an apple, if I drop an apple and then I watch the moon or Venus go through the sky, there's nothing just on the surface of things, prima facie, on the face of things, that would make me, I think it's safe to say there's nothing on the surface of things that would even remotely suggest that the same law of physics or the same force is responsible for dropping the apple, or the apple falling, and the planets careening through their orbits in space, and the Earth itself. Right? There's nothing in the appearance of things that would suggest that there's any relationship between those two phenomena, those two events. But what this famous scientist Isaac Newton offered people was a theory, a concept of universal gravitation, which enables us to, in some ways, see a relationship that it's not seeing it, it's having insight into a relationship that otherwise appears as two separate things. Right? And so we don't see the planets moving through space and the apple falling. We don't see them as the same thing until we have a theory that enables us to see them as the same thing. Right? It's in the last video I used this other example. It's not at all unlike the elephant. Having a theory of an elephant enables us to recognize all of its manifestations, and so both in a diversity of elephants, diversity of forms of elephant, and then also in the diversity of aspects. And by diversity of aspects, I can think of specifically the parable of the blind man and the elephant. It's like different sides or different aspects of the elephant. Without the theory of the elephant, it's impossible to correlate those two things. And so that's what we have been trying to do with intelligence itself, and try to explore and really get to know, in a sense. So know through familiarity, through engagement with intelligence. We've been attempting to get to know intelligence so that then we have a way of even approaching, we have a groundwork to approach the question of artificial intelligence. I think on that note, it's also important to consider the first term of that phrase. We've been talking about intelligence. We haven't really talked about artificial, except implicitly. And the reason that I say that is because the notion of artificial, it's almost synonymous with technological. When we think of the term artificial, it's always used as, in some ways, in a contrast to what is natural. And so artificial we call things artificial when they are in some way the product of human artifice, and we contrast that to somehow spontaneous emergence from nature, maybe, more or less. Artificial then, but it can also imply other less primary meanings. I'm thinking of artificial. Artificial can sometimes mean simulated. If we think of and we can think of it as a simulation of a given function. We can think of if you have a pond and then you have an artificial pond, they're similar in important respects, in the sense that ducks can swim in them, for example. So then we have another inflection of the term artificial. It can mean in some ways a simulation or something that replicates or imitates a something original, right? But it's always and so if we think of artificial in terms of simulating something, then we immediately set up another aspect to this question, which is there's an original that's being simulated, right? And I think this is extremely germane to the question of artificial intelligence too, and the related question of virtual reality. It's really impossible to talk about a simulation of something or an imitation of something unless we have a standard that's being simulated or imitated, right? And so in some ways this just once again turns us back onto ourselves, so to speak, and really drives home the importance of understanding and reflecting upon intelligence itself, so that we do have a clear and comprehensive understanding of intelligence, which is the standard in this relation. Right? It's very difficult to talk about a simulation it's impossible to talk about a simulation by itself. We have to be able to. We can only talk about the simulation in relation to the thing that is being simulated, right? The thing that's being imitated. And artifice, in Latin, it means something very similar to technology in the first place. And so then our question of, when we think about artificial intelligence, what is the function that is being replicated or simulated, right? Because so it's and clearly the answer is intelligence, but it's obviously not sufficient just to say that word, and I hope that to this point we've developed some understanding of what we can mean by the word intelligence. And so we have the thought in our mind, like, okay, some function of our own selves is being simulated through something like computers or broadly construed artificial intelligence. And in fact, but then it's a question of can we say more? Can we be more specific? And people have proposed different answers to that kind of question. But one of the famous answers, because you can imagine it's like, how do we know when we've been successful in successfully simulating in the intelligence that we are familiar with? How do we know when we've artificially created that kind of intelligence? And so you can imagine there could be different ways to answer a question like that. And it's also possible that the question doesn't have the kind of answer that we're looking for in that way. And so I think we should just hold that as a possibility, because nothing guarantees that any question like what is our standard to measure whether we've successfully created something that's artificially intelligent. Nothing guarantees that there is such a standard that we can measure it with. But many people have proposed different standards, and many of them they're broadly accepted. And one in particular has become something like a gold standard for measuring the degree of success to which artificial intelligence has achieved this kind of parity with the intelligence that we are familiar with, human intelligence that we're familiar with. And this was proposed by a famous mathematician around the time of World War II called Alan Turing was his name. And so he formulated what is called the Turing Test. And it's still known by that name today, and you can sometimes read that phrase in an article in a newspaper, for example, or a magazine. the Turing Test, in very simple terms, the idea is that something is artificially intelligent, or even it's even sometimes phrased as something is conscious, and by something I mean an artificial device. Artificial intelligence is in fact intelligent if it can, and this is the Turing Test, if when a normal person is relating to it or engaging with it, that person can't tell a difference. In other words, that person can't tell that he's actually talking to a computer. Right? So the computer is able to successfully simulate a human being intelligence on the other side. And you can see that, so even today there are still experiments, and you can go on certain engineering sites where they have they're testing, they're basically performing the Turing test on different programs and software and bots that they have. And so the idea is like, can you tell that this I don't want to call it a person because in some ways it's not a person, but can you tell that if you're exchanging, if you're trying to communicate with something, when you get a response on your computer screen, if you can't tell that it's not a person on the other side, if you right, so it's a computer program, it's software that's giving you a response. But if you can't tell that it's software, then this program has, as it were, passed the Turing test. Right, so the Turing test is this kind of metric, and you can see why it's very important and useful to have a gold standard metric like that is widely accepted. It's because again, it gives you a way to discriminate between what has achieved that level and what has failed to achieve that level. And so when we think of a standard like that, you can apply it, and it's again very helpful and useful to have some kind of standard like that. And it's been very useful. And for example, one way in which that standard appeared in a little bit of a modified form, but it was this is during my childhood in the 90s. It was a continual kind of contest between developers of artificial intelligence at IBM, at Microsoft, and world champion chess players. And because chess is one of the most, it's almost like the quintessential demonstration of intellectual prowess, right? It's like a symbol of intelligence as a master chess player. And so the idea is like, well, if we can create a software program that can, achieve victory against the greatest human chess player, then in some important respect that the robots have won. They've, right, in at least one respect, which is this chess playing. And I believe it was sometime in the mid or late 90s, 96 maybe or 97, that in fact this program designed by IBM called Deep Blue, it beat the grandmaster of chess over several games, and so it beat the grandmaster in the whole entire match. And you can imagine this was it still remains quite a milestone in this kind of technological development and advance of artificial intelligence. You can see that in an important respect, you can see how that's an example of, in a modified form, but it's an example of the Turing test, because if your chess player on the other side is able to outplay the grandmaster, then this is clearly it's clear that this software program has achieved a very high level of parity and even supremacy over human intelligence. And now, but before we and so again, in the spirit of of critical thinking and not approaching questions like these in terms of so much as seeking an answer, which would be in some ways naive thinking as we define it, which is kind of the idea that knowledge is the same thing as propositions. But rather to approach this in terms of critical thinking, which is how do we understand this, try to achieve try to explore this, see this from different sides, approaching this question from different sides. We should also just wonder whether a test like the Turing Test, just because it's useful and just because it's actionable and just because we can apply it, that alone doesn't ensure that it's true. And by true, again, I just mean, is it true to what we mean by intelligence? For example, it would be very convenient and actionable if we could say everyone with brown hair has coronavirus, and so we can just quarantine those people and everyone, right? But obviously, that's useful. You could put it into use, but it's not true, and so it's not going to accomplish what you're hoping to accomplish. Now, if the Turing Test is intended to, again, evaluate whether artificial intelligence has really achieved parity with actual intelligence, we have to ask a similar question and say, just because this test we're able to apply it, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's showing us the truth here. And so we have to inquire critically, and maybe it is, but maybe it isn't too. And I think it will be immediately obvious that the answer to that question of whether the Turing Test is true, the answer to that question is, of course, obviously, contingent on what we mean by intelligence. Right? And so now we've kind of come into a circle, and in some way I imagine we've arrayed different aspects of this question out on the table before us, and so we can circumspect them and have a more comprehensive picture of what is really at stake. I will pause this video and just to divide this lecture into two pieces, and I will return momentarily.